Have you ever looked up at the night sky and wondered if the lights you see are stars or something far more terrifying? Imagine standing in your home in the middle of the night, hearing the distant hum of aircraft, and then watching the sky erupt in streaks of fire as air defense systems scramble to intercept threats you cannot even see. That was the reality for residents of Tehran on a recent July night. The sky over the eastern half of the Iranian capital lit up with tracer fire, and the unmistakable rhythm of anti-aircraft systems echoed through the Sohanak neighborhood. But here is the twist that changes everything you think you know about this story. The confirmed strikes that night did not actually hit Tehran itself. Before we unpack what really happened and why this night matters more than you might realize, take a moment to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. We are covering this conflict in real time, and you will want to stay ahead of the headlines. Share this video with anyone who wants to understand what is really happening beneath the surface of the news. The explosions you heard about, the air defenses you saw activated, they all happened. But the actual American strikes that night landed far from the capital, near the northwestern city of Tabriz and across a cluster of towns in southern Iran. The distinction between what was perceived and what was confirmed is the key that unlocks this entire story. And understanding that difference is exactly what separates reliable analysis from the noise that floods social media every time a major event like this unfolds. Let us step back and look at the bigger picture, because nothing about that tense night in Tehran makes sense without understanding everything that came before it. On February 28, 2026, the United States and Israel launched a coordinated series of large-scale airstrikes against Iran. This was not a spontaneous decision. It was the culmination of months of escalating tensions, diplomatic failures, and military preparations. According to the Council on Foreign Relations Global Conflict Tracker, those strikes came after Iran refused to meet American demands to end all uranium enrichment activity. President Trump stated openly that the war's objectives were to destroy Iran's ballistic missile capabilities, eliminate its navy, and permanently prevent Iran from acquiring a nuclear weapon. He also explicitly called for a regime change, encouraging Iranians to move against their own government. The opening strikes did something that completely reshaped the entire conflict. They killed Iran's supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, who had led the Islamic Republic since 1989. Think about the magnitude of the moment. The man who had been the ultimate authority in Iran for nearly 4 decades was gone in a single night. Tehran's assembly of experts moved quickly to appoint his son, Mojtaba Khamenei, as his successor. Iran's defense minister at the time was also killed in those opening strikes, leaving the country's military command structure scrambling to reconstitute itself in real time while under active attack. Iran's retaliation was immediate and geographically wide. The Islamic Republic launched a series of ballistic missile and drone attacks aimed at American assets and partner nation infrastructure across the region. One of the earliest retaliatory strikes hit the United Arab Emirates, where Iranian missiles killed 3 foreign workers from Pakistan, Nepal, and Bangladesh, and injured 58 others. Those strikes were aimed at American military assets and bases hosted on Emirati soil. Iran also moved to close the Strait of Hormuz, the narrow waterway through which roughly a fifth of the world's oil supply passes. This triggered what became known as the Strait of Hormuz crisis. In response, the United States imposed a naval blockade on Iran starting April 13, 2026. American ships intercepted vessels attempting to leave Iranian ports through the strait. The U.S. Department of Defense estimated that blockade had cost Iran $48 billion in lost oil revenue by the start of May. By May 7th, the conflict had entered what analysts described as its second stage. The United States conducted additional airstrikes on southern Iran and on Tehran itself. This time, Washington framed the strikes as self-defense following Iranian targeting of U.S. warships during an operation the Pentagon named Operation Project Freedom. Iranian officials claimed the strikes were carried out jointly by the United States and the United Arab Emirates, though that claim of direct Emirati military participation was disputed. What is not disputed is that by early May, both sides were locked into a pattern that would define the rest of the year. American strikes degrading Iranian military infrastructure in successive waves, and Iranian retaliation aimed at U.S. partner nations and shipping lanes across the Gulf. It is worth noting that the February 28th strikes did not come out of nowhere. They followed a 12-day air war between Israel and Iran that had already taken place in June 2025, months earlier. The United States and Israel had repeatedly warned throughout that period that they would strike again if Iran continued its nuclear enrichment and ballistic missile programs. When the strikes finally came in February 2026, an Iranian official told Reuters that Tehran was preparing what that official called a crushing retaliation. Iran's civil aviation organization closed the country's airspace until further notice. Khamenei himself was reportedly moved out of Tehran to a secure location in the immediate aftermath of the opening strikes before he was ultimately killed. On that same day, The United States designated Iran a state sponsor of what it called wrongful detention, the first country ever placed on that particular list. Secretary of State Marco Rubio called on Iran to release all American citizens it was holding at the time and warned that U.S. passports could eventually be declared invalid for travel to Iran altogether. President Trump stated he wanted zero uranium enrichment in Iran going forward, even for civilian purposes. That maximalist demand set the tone for how difficult any negotiated resolution was going to be from the very first day of the war. Within the war's opening days, U.S. Central Command also moved to shape the information environment directly. In a statement issued in early March, CENTCOM accused the Iranian regime of launching one-way attack drones and ballistic missiles from what it called heavily populated cities, specifically naming Dezful, Isfahan, and Shiraz. CENTCOM's commander at the time said that Iran's government was blatantly disregarding civilian lives by launching attacks from populated areas while compromising the safety of its own people. The command warned that locations used for military purposes could lose their protected status under international law. CENTCOM added that U.S. forces take every feasible precaution to minimize civilian harm, while acknowledging it could not guarantee safety near sites used by Iran for military purposes. Whatever one makes of the framing on either side, that early dispute over the use of civilian areas for military launches became a recurring feature of how both the war and its coverage unfolded in the months that followed. Now we move forward into the summer when the campaign that produced that tense night in Tehran actually took shape. By mid-July 2026, U.S. Central Command had settled into a pattern of near-nightly strikes against Iran, each one publicly announced, each one framed around a single strategic objective, protecting commercial shipping through the Strait of Hormuz. On the night of July 20th into July 21st, CENTCOM carried out what it called its 10th consecutive night of strikes. In a statement to Al Jazeera, the White House said the strikes on Iran would continue until President Trump decided otherwise, while adding that diplomatic talks between Washington and Tehran remained ongoing in parallel with the bombing campaign. That 10th night saw Iranian state media report explosions in Sirik, Bandar Abbas, Keshem Island, Shiraz, and Isfahan. A wide geographic spread concentrated in Iran's south near the strait itself. The very next night is where our story sharpens into focus. At 8:15 p.m. Eastern Time on July 21st, 2026, U.S. Central Command announced it had successfully completed the 11th consecutive evening of strikes against Iran, a campaign that had begun roughly an hour earlier. According to CENTCOM's own statement, the targets that night included Iranian military operations centers, maritime capabilities, aircraft hangars, drone storage facilities, and military logistics infrastructure, all aimed at what the command described as further degrading Iran's ability to threaten commercial shipping through the Strait of Hormuz. CENTCOM's statement was specific about the scale of the underlying problem it said it was addressing, noting that over the preceding 3 months, Iran had attacked more than 30 commercial vessels transiting the waterway. Attacks that CENTCOM said had endangered hundreds of mariners and undermined freedom of navigation in one of the world's most important shipping corridors. Despite that, CENTCOM stressed the Strait of Hormuz remained open for commercial traffic. On the ground, the picture that emerged that night was more layered than any single press release could capture. Al Jazeera's correspondents reported that massive explosions were heard in the area surrounding the Iranian capital, well before CENTCOM's formal statement confirming the night's strikes. Iran's Tasnim news agency, a semi-official outlet close to the Revolutionary Guard, reported that explosions were also heard in parts of Bushehr province in Iran's south. Separately, the Iranian outlet Fars News reported that American forces had struck a military site on the outskirts of Tabriz in northwestern Iran at approximately 2:40 in the morning local time. Fars, citing local crisis management officials, said the strike hit a military zone outside the city itself and that there were no attacks reported inside Tabriz proper. It was against this backdrop, air raid activity confirmed in the south, a new strike near Tabriz in the northwest, that Tehran itself became part of the story. Al Jazeera's correspondent reporting from inside Iran said air defense systems in the eastern part of Tehran had been activated, but that officials were clear there were no attacks on the Iranian capital as of that point in the night. Iranian state television went further in its own reporting, saying air defense activity could be heard in the western, eastern, and northeastern parts of Tehran simultaneously. This suggested the city's layered defense network had responded to multiple perceived threats or incoming tracks across different quadrants of the capital at once. Israel National News, drawing on Iranian reporting, specified that the most concentrated activity was in the Sohanak neighborhood in northeastern Tehran. Iranian media separately reported air defenses activating west of Tehran and near the town of Sirik as well. Noor News itself reported that Tehran's air defense systems had been activated against what it called hostile targets, a description consistent with a city on the defensive rather than one under direct confirmed bombardment. This is precisely the kind of moment where a story either gets exaggerated into something it was not, or gets reported honestly. Tehran's skies were active and its defenses were firing. But the confirmed strikes that night landed outside the capital near Tabriz and in the south, not inside Tehran's city limits. If you are finding this level of detail valuable, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. We are committed to bringing you the facts without the hype, and your support helps us keep doing that. Share this with someone who needs to understand the difference between what actually happened and what the headlines might suggest. There is also important context for why Tehran and Tabriz mattered specifically as targets that week. Al Jazeera's own reporting on the 11th night noted that strikes on Tabriz and on the Tehran area marked a departure from the general pattern of the campaign up to that point, which had largely concentrated on southern Iran and the areas immediately surrounding the Strait of Hormuz. In other words, this was read at the time as a signal that the campaign's geographic scope was widening, moving closer to Iran's political and population centers in the north, rather than staying confined to the military and maritime infrastructure, clustered around the strait in the south. There was also a warning issued hours before that night's strikes began. Iran's Qadam al-Anbiya Central Headquarters, the operational command structure of the Iranian Armed Forces, issued a statement carried by the IRNA news agency, cautioning the United States against striking Iran's nuclear facilities specifically. The statement said that if what it called the invading and terrorist forces took that step, it would be regarded as an escalation of conflict across the entire region. That warning is worth including here, not because it changes what CENTCOM says it targeted that night: military operations centers, maritime capabilities, hangars, drone storage, and logistics infrastructure, but because it shows the psychological backdrop in Tehran going into that evening. A government bracing for the possibility that the campaign could expand into a new and far more dangerous phase focused on nuclear sites, even as the strikes that actually landed stayed within the pattern CENTCOM had followed for 10 nights before it. Iran's retaliation to the 11th night came quickly, and it followed the same regional pattern that had defined the war since February. Iran's military said it had struck U.S. and linked sites in Kuwait, Bahrain, and Jordan in response. This was consistent with how Iran had responded to earlier waves of strikes throughout the campaign. They used their remaining missile and drone capacity to hit American and partner nation infrastructure across the Gulf, rather than attempting a direct large-scale strike on Israeli or American territory itself. This was a reflection of how degraded Iran's long-range strike capability had already become after nearly 5 months of sustained American and Israeli targeting. Now it is worth pausing here and being honest about a claim that circulated from Iranian state media during this period that we cannot verify and are not going to present as fact. Iran's Revolutionary Guard Corps, in a separate report carried by Press TV in early March, claimed that its retaliatory strikes had crippled a major U.S. airbase in Bahrain and had caused more than 680 American casualties in the first 2 days of the war. That figure has never been corroborated by CENTCOM, by any Western wire service, or by any independent source we could locate. It stands in sharp contrast to CENTCOM's own confirmed reporting of U.S. military deaths. During the conflict, which by early March had CENTCOM confirming a total of 7 American service members killed since the war began. We are flagging the IRGC's much higher casualty claims specifically, so you understand it exists in the information environment around this war. And specifically, so you understand why we are not repeating it as though it were verified. This is exactly the kind of gap between state media claims and confirmed reporting that responsible coverage of this war has to hold open rather than paper over. To understand the stakes CENTCOM said it was defending on the night Tehran's air defenses activated, it helps to look at what happened just 1 week earlier on July 14th, when the tempo of the war briefly spiked in a different way. Al Jazeera's live coverage from that period noted that CENTCOM had already been conducting consecutive nightly strikes for over a week by the time the 11th night arrived. Each one publicly logged, each one tied to the same stated objective of protecting the roughly 1,000 vessel transits and hundreds of millions of barrels of crude oil that CENTCOM says it has helped move safely through the Strait of Hormuz since the blockade period ended in early May. The war did not simply continue at that same intensity indefinitely after the 11th night. In the days that followed, the tempo shifted again. By July 24th, CENTCOM had extended its campaign to a 13th consecutive night, this time leading its published target list for the first time with military command centers and communication networks specifically, while Iran's Tasnim agency reported 4 people killed near the city of Abbas. That same day, Iran rejected a ceasefire proposal that had been carried to Tehran by Iraq's prime minister, reportedly centered on the question of control over the Strait of Hormuz. President Trump told Axios he was weighing what he described as a massive attack, one he said would be bigger than ever before. The Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps declared the strait completely closed following a tanker fire on its southern shipping route. Oil markets responded immediately and sharply. Brent crude settled at $106.69 a barrel that day, its first close above the $100 mark since May 22nd. A clear signal of how seriously energy markets were taking the risk of a wider, longer war. In Washington, the House of Representatives voted 214 to 208 to call for an end to the war, while a parallel effort in the Senate fell just short, 49 to 47, of the threshold needed to force a binding vote under the war powers framework. By July 31st, the pattern shifted yet again, this time toward de-escalation, at least temporarily. The United States announced no new strikes on Iran overnight, the first quiet night after what had been described as a heavy wave of strikes on July 29th and 30th. Iran fired no ballistic missiles that night for the first time in 3 nights, though it did claim a retaliatory drone attack that Kuwait and Washington did not confirm. In Washington, the Senate blocked a war powers resolution sponsored by Senators Schiff, Kenney, and Schumer by a vote of 50 to 49. The second such failed attempt in 2 weeks, even as the 60-day clock under the War Powers Act continued running toward a September deadline that would force a fresh legal reckoning over the president's authority to continue the campaign without new congressional authorization. Saudi Arabia proposed a multinational naval coalition specifically to protect Red Sea shipping, a sign that the war's disruption to global trade routes was spreading concern well beyond Iran's immediate neighbors. Brent crude settled that day at $89.30, down nearly 2% from its recent peak, but still on pace for a monthly gain of roughly 21%. A shipping analytics firm counted 14 transits through the Strait of Hormuz in a single day, roughly triple the rate recorded just the week before. This suggested traffic through the strait was cautiously recovering, even as the underlying conflict remained unresolved. That same day, Egypt attributed a series of fires at the port of Damietta to a drone strike, which Reuters reported had hit a U.S.-owned gas storage tanker, adding yet another data point to the growing list of maritime and energy infrastructure incidents tied to the broader war. We are now deep into this analysis, and if you have made it this far, you clearly care about understanding the full picture. That is exactly why we need your help. Hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and share this video on your social media. The more people who see this, the more informed the conversation becomes. Every share makes a difference, which brings us to where things stand right now in the first week of August 2026. A little more than 2 weeks after the night Tehran's air defenses lit up the sky over Sohanak. The picture today is in some ways the opposite of the 11th night, a period of active diplomacy rather than active bombing, though one still shadowed by the possibility that the campaign could resume at any time. CNN's live coverage this week reported that claims of progress are emerging in talks aimed at ending the standoff, even as separate. CNN reporting, citing unnamed sources, said U.S. munition stockpiles are now described as dangerously low. Nearly 80% of the interceptors for one key American missile defense system already depleted after months of intercepting Iranian ballistic missiles and drones. According to that same reporting, this munition shortage is a significant part of why the White House has so far declined to approve a more aggressive option that CENTCOM had reportedly presented, described as a 1 to 2 week intensified bombardment campaign. The Gulf host governments, according to the same reporting, have separately raised concerns about whether their own remaining air defense stocks would be sufficient to absorb a fresh round of Iranian retaliation if the larger bombardment option were approved. On the diplomatic track, Al Jazeera reported this week that Iran and Oman are in the final stages of drafting a deal that would grant Tehran a degree of control over ships entering the Gulf through the Strait of Hormuz. According to a senior Iranian source and 2 regional officials, Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent told CNBC that a U.S.-Iran arrangement to fully reopen the strait could come as soon as Tuesday or Wednesday of this week. Secretary of State Marco Rubio told the Jerusalem Post that Washington sees genuine progress in the Hormuz talks and hopes for an agreement very shortly. Gulf News, citing Qatari officials, reported that a draft agreement to reopen the Strait of Hormuz was already circulating among the relevant parties. CENTCOM itself said it had assisted more than 1,000 vessel transits through the strait over the preceding 3 months alone and told Middle East Eye that the strait remains free and open for commercial shipping despite the months of disruption. But here is where the story gets even more complicated. Iran's state broadcaster quoted an informed source as saying the discussions between Tehran and Oman have nothing to do with the United States. The IRGC linked outlet reported that the delay in reaching any final understanding was directly attributed to what it called America's interference and Trump's threats. An Iranian source, cited separately by the Emirati outlet, put it even more bluntly, saying that as long as U.S. interference and threats of military attack against Iran continue, any agreement will be delayed, and that Iran will not accept any arrangement reached under the shadow of threats. So even as American officials describe a deal as imminent, Iran's own state and semi-official media are simultaneously insisting that Washington is not even a legitimate party to the negotiation, and that ongoing American military pressure is actively slowing down, not speeding up, any resolution. That is a genuine unresolved contradiction in the public record right now, not a detail we can smooth over, and it should factor into how much confidence anyone puts in reports that a deal is just days away. There is also a telling detail buried in the most recent daily reporting on the war that speaks to how normalized this conflict has become for people living through it. According to updates carried on the global security tracking site, Iranian institutions have continued behaving as though a new strike remains likely at any moment, irrespective of how the diplomacy plays out, with informed sources continuing to report on military preparations, even during the current relative lull. In Washington, President Trump himself invoked the length and casualty tolls of America's past wars: the 20-year Afghan War with roughly 2,000 dead, the 19-and-a-half-year Vietnam War with its 58,000 American dead, the 3-year Korean War with its more than 36,000 American dead, alongside what he described as an essentially bloodless one-day Venezuelan conflict. He contrasted all of them with what he characterized as an Iranian military conflict that had, at that point in the timeline, lasted 4 months and cost 18 American lives. Whatever one makes of that framing, it illustrates how central the human cost of this specific war and the question of how it compares to America's other conflicts has become in the domestic political conversation around whether and how it should continue. So where does that leave the night that gives this story its title? The 11th consecutive night of CENTCOM strikes against Iran on July 21st into July 22nd. 2026 was real, confirmed by CENTCOM's own public statement, corroborated independently by Al Jazeera correspondents reporting from inside Iran, and covered in detail by multiple additional outlets. Tehran's air defense systems did activate that night across multiple neighborhoods in the eastern, western, and northeastern parts of the city, most specifically noted in the Sohanik district. Confirmed strikes that night landed near Tabriz and across a spread of towns in Iran's south, not inside the Iranian capital itself. A distinction that officials on the ground were explicit about even as the sirens sounded and the tracer fire lit up Tehran's skies. It was a significant, closely documented night inside a much longer war, one chapter in a campaign that has now stretched across roughly half a year, moved through phases of intense bombardment and brief lulls, drawn in Kuwait, Bahrain, Jordan, and the United Arab Emirates as targets of Iranian retaliation, reshaped global oil markets, and repeatedly tested the limits of American congressional oversight through a string of failed war powers votes. Before we close, a brief accounting of where this information comes from and what remains contested. The core details of the July 21st to 22nd night, CENTCOM's own statement, the 11th consecutive night framing, the stated targets and stated purpose tied to Strait of Hormuz shipping, come directly from CENTCOM's official public release. The reporting on air defenses, activating over Tehran, and specifically in the Sohanik neighborhood, comes from Al Jazeera's correspondents on the ground, corroborated by Israel National News citing Iranian outlets. The strike near Tabriz comes from Fars news agency, an outlet close to the Iranian state and should be read with that in mind, though its account of a strike outside rather than inside the city was consistent with other reporting on the night's pattern. The broader war timeline from the February 28th opening strikes and the killing of Ali Khamenei through the naval blockade. The May strikes and into the summer campaign draws on the Council on Foreign Relations Global Conflict Tracker. The most recent developments on munitions depletion, the Hormuz negotiations, and the competing Iranian and American characterizations of those talks come from CNN, Al Jazeera, CNBC, the Jerusalem Post, Gulf News, and Middle East Eye reporting published in the first days of August 2026. The IRGC's claim of roughly 680 American casualties in the war's opening days is explicitly unverified, sourced only to Iranian state media, and stands in direct contradiction to CENTCOM's own confirmed casualty figures, which is exactly why we have flagged rather than repeated it as fact. The question of whether a Hormuz deal is genuinely close, as American officials suggest, or is actively being slowed by what Iranian sources describe as ongoing U.S. interference, remains a live, unresolved disagreement between the two governments as of this recording. It is also worth sitting for a moment with the sheer scale of the military buildup that made a campaign like this possible in the first place. According to the sourced entry on the 2026 United States military buildup in the Middle East, The deployment that preceded and then sustained this war involved 3 separate carrier strike groups, along with elements of Naval Special Warfare Development Group, Navy SEAL units, Air Force and Marine Corps assets, and Army units ranging from the 82nd Airborne and 101st Airborne Divisions to the 10th Mountain Division, plus special operations elements. That buildup, which officially began on January 26, 2026, roughly a month before the first strikes were launched, was described in its own stated objectives as aiming not just to prevent Iran from acquiring weapons of mass destruction, but explicitly to prepare for strikes on Iran and to pursue regime change. Objectives that were publicly stated well before the shooting actually started. Understanding that this was a buildup planned and staged over weeks, rather than a sudden decision, helps explain why the campaign was able to sustain 11, then 13 consecutive nights of strikes without the kind of logistical strain that might stop a smaller or less prepared force, at least until the interceptor shortages that CNN reported on this month began to bite. This is the moment where we ask for your help one more time. If you have watched this far, you are exactly the kind of viewer we created this channel for. Hit subscribe, turn on the bell, and leave a comment with your thoughts on this conflict. Your engagement is what keeps this channel growing and allows us to bring you more in-depth analysis on the stories that shape our world. The story of that night over Tehran is not just about tracer fire and air defense systems. It is a window into a conflict that has reshaped the Middle East, tested the limits of American military power, and left both sides trapped in a cycle of escalation that neither seems able to break. The sirens have quieted for now. The skies over Tehran are dark again, but the underlying tensions that lit up those skies remain unresolved. And as long as they do, any night could be the night it all starts again. We genuinely want to know where you stand on this. Do you believe military pressure can force Iran to change course? Or does this conflict only end at a negotiating table? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. The conversation matters just as much as the analysis. Thanks for watching, and we will see you in the next one.